All right. So to kick this thing off, first I wanted to go through how Panvala works, a brief overview, and then dive into the governance model, what the Panvala Caucus is, how it fits in, compare it with some other themes that you might be more familiar with, and then go into the staking clusters that we introduced for this quarter, which is kind of a core part of the governance and economic model of the system now, and then open it up for Q&A. So in general with Panvala, what we're trying to demonstrate is that holders are philanthropists. If we can take Bitcoin subsidy model, where the holders are being diluted each 10 minutes to subsidize the security of the network, and apply it to other things and say, hey, let's create a currency, have the supply inflate at a predictable rate, and then use those new tokens to subsidize what's going on in communities, I think that could be a really big deal. So that's what we're trying to do here. People think of Bitcoin and Ether holders as basically just investors, but again, we see them as philanthropists as well. In Bitcoin, people have been diluting their holdings of the network in order to subsidize Bitcoin itself. Bitcoin could not have the security it has today without large subsidies. So they're effectively subsidizing a public good. The Bitcoin network security can be shared by all of us, and it doesn't degrade when more people use it. It's something that we can all share. But it's being subsidized by these people who are also making money at the same time. People don't really think about Bitcoin holders as philanthropists because they've seen how much money Bitcoin holders have made over the past decade or so. It just doesn't click. But that's the breakthrough. That's the big deal that's happened in the space. For the last 10 years, people have been outlandishly rewarded for subsidizing public goods. And if we could make that happen for things besides security, it would be a really big deal. So in the Bitcoin model, to get an idea of what the subsidy is, if you compare the block rewards to the fees on the network, right now Bitcoin is matching at 60x. These numbers are from before the halving, just so you know, but basically each quarter there's about 150,000 Bitcoins coming out as block rewards, while only 2,500 Bitcoins are being spent in fees each quarter. So that's the subsidy was 60 times the fees. So if you take that same lens and apply it to Panvala, for the quarter that ended January 31st, it was matching at 11.2x. So you take the tokens coming in as donations and compare them to the tokens coming out as inflation, and that inflation was 11.2 times the donations coming into the system. So again, it's not as high as Bitcoin 60x right now, but it's still much higher than what you would be familiar with in the traditional world, where a rich person says, hey, I'm going to match every donation you make to this charity I like. For every dollar you put in, I'm going to put in $1. That's 2x matching. Right now, Panvala is doing 11.2x matching, and that's pretty impressive. So that's for the quarter that ended January 31st. For the quarter after that, this past quarter, we matched donations that were going on Gitcoin grants. So people made their own donations using the PAN token, and then we came in with what some of the inflation budget that we set aside for this purpose, and came in and matched all those donations. So 35 donors donated a total of 115,000 PAN, and what we set aside for them was 1.5 million PAN. So last quarter, we matched at 12.9x for the donations that were happening on Gitcoin grants. People who received donations in PAN end up getting a lot more value than the people who received donations in DAI or in Ether, because there was a second match coming in from Panvala itself, which matched at 12.9x. So we have the subsidy system, but how do we govern the subsidy system? That's where the Panvala Caucus comes in. That's why we formed this group. Panvala's smart contracts have a constraint that we introduced, and that constraint is that only one proposal for the budget can be executed in any quarter. Any number of proposals can be created, but only one of them is actually going to succeed. And that constraint is there to really force us to discuss things off-chain. We have to have meetings, we have to get together, we have to say, hey, this is what we're going to do this next quarter. We'll kind of have to reach consensus up front. We can't just throw small proposals on chain and see which ones get 51% of the vote. we really have to have a single budget proposal that's going to be executed. So it's kind of a constraint that forces off-chain governance rather than having each proposal be its own referendum. So that's what the Panvala Caucus's role is. It's a group in which we try to reach consensus among as many token holders as possible. So when we put that proposal on chain, it actually succeeds. When you put those proposals on chain, you have to stake tokens on them. So you really want to make sure that the proposal is the consensus of the community, because if your proposal loses, if somebody puts a different proposal out there and it wins, then you're going to lose the tokens that you staked on the proposal. So there's this incentive to make sure that consensus has been reached before you put a proposal on chain, and that's what we do each quarter. So you could think of it kind of like Ethereum's core devs, where there's this group that's making recommendations for what goes into each fork. But at the end of the day, the miners don't have to accept those recommendations. They can reject it and not run back. And then Panvala is the same sort of model. But the token holders can accept or reject those recommendations. They can always decide to make their own proposal and compete with it on chain if they don't like what the Panvala Caucus is about. There's actually numbers didn't update this slide, but you can join. All you need is PAN tokens and a willingness to cooperate with the people who are in it, so that we can make recommendations that move Panvala forward. This has the updated number. We have 23 members. We meet monthly to discuss what's happening each quarter. We want to make sure that we have the budget for the next quarter kind of finalized, and then we want to get on the same page about what's happening in Panvala. We also help communities set up staking clusters, which is a new part of our governance and budget model that I'll get to in a second. But we really want to be as plugged as possible throughout the Ethereum ecosystems right now, and as we grow throughout wherever we have communities, because we have to help them kind of get on the same page so they can cooperate with the other communities that are trying to share this subsidy system. So another comparison besides Ethereum core devs that you can use is sports. So I've been relying a lot on this comparison between Panvala as a league of communities with sports that have their leagues of teams. So in Panvala, what the League of Communities is doing is they're working together to pursue subsidies. They're trying to make sure as much subsidies as possible are coming from Panvala's token supply, but they're also trying to get corporate sponsorships together because they can share those as well. As much subsidy as they can get, they want to do it together because by working together, they can get more subsidies than they could individually. And if you compare that to sports leagues, it's really the same sort of model. When you have the NBA working together to get big corporate sponsorships, they can get much larger sponsorships than any individual team can. And it's that same sort of model that's in Panvala. You can think of it kind of like as a sports league, but instead of it being teams that are competing with each other in a game, it's communities that are working to subsidize the work that they do on their own, but by cooperating, they can do a lot more together. As far as the governance goes, in Panvala, it's the caucus that's helping token holders reach consensus on what's happening. It doesn't have any way to enforce anything on the system because, again, it doesn't control the system. It's the token holders voting when necessary that controls the system. So you can compare it to governing bodies in sports like the IOC for the Olympics or FIFA for soccer that helps the teams reach consensus on what they're doing together. Anyone can pick up a soccer ball and kick it around without needing anybody's permission, but the governing bodies help people work together to arrange tournaments, to figure out the rules, etc. So you can give the Panvala Caucus and the governance of Panvala as kind of a governing body for sports. I hope that analogy works well for you. I'm looking for feedback on that, but I think of it a lot like a league in sports. So the staking system that we introduced this quarter is really important because we want communities to earn their own subsidies in the system. Last quarter, we basically matched any donation that was happening on Gitcoin grants. But for this upcoming quarter, it's the communities that are earning their own subsidies and selecting which projects they want to benefit from those subsidies. So this quarter, it's not going to be every project that gets matched. It's just going to be the projects that are supported by one of the communities that has a staking cluster in the system. Right now, there are 5 communities that have staking clusters. There's Hashing It Out, which is a Ethereum podcast, Common Stack, working on funding the commons, Node that works on infrastructure for Ethereum, Metacartel that's trying to incubate DAOs, and DXDAO that's trying to create DeFi projects. Those are the 5 communities right now that have staked tokens and will be earning a matching budget for this quarter. Going forward, we want more and more clusters. We want more communities with Ethereum to be involved. They want to get out of Ethereum to have for anyone to use it. But this is that we have for this quarter. The idea with these staking clusters is that it's kind of social off-chain kind of staking system, the same way that I described the constraint and for staking also happens off-chain. So it's not that you're giving up control over your tokens. It's really that you're sending a message, I want to stake tokens with my community. And then when the matching budget is allocated to your community, it's not coming from your staked tokens, it's coming from the inflation of the Panvala token supply. So each staking cluster is trying to get as many donations as possible, because again, it's a matching budget. If you don't get any donations, you don't have any budget. If you get a small amount of donations, you have a small budget. It's still bigger than you would have had if you didn't have the matching budget, but you really want as many donations as possible so you can have as much matching as possible. And you also want more community members to stake tokens in your cluster so it doesn't exceed its capacity. And Panvala staked tokens are capacity for matching. So one way to think about it is if you imagine that you had a staking cluster that had 10% of all staked tokens in your cluster, then you raise donations that were 5% of all donations, then you would kind of be in the situation that's in this image right here. You're within your capacity. You had 10% of the staked tokens, but brought in 5% of the donations, so you're good. You're going to get matched at the highest rate possible because you didn't exceed your capacity. But imagine you had that same 10% of the staked tokens, but you had 20% of the donations for a quarter. In that scenario, you've exceeded your capacity. It's still better to get as many donations as possible. You still earn more matching with each new donation that comes in, but you won't get the highest matching rates anymore. Because again, we want people to have matching that's proportional to their share of the stake in the system. So you still get matched when you exceed the capacity, but you would be matched more if you staked more tokens. So that's the kind of dynamic that we want to play out here. You want to stake tokens if you want more donation capacity, and you want to maximize donations so you can get as large of a matching budget as possible. So that's really how the governance model of Panvala works. The Panvala Caucus gathers each quarter to make a recommendation of what goes into the system, and then the staking clusters form to decide on their own what projects they want to match. And they allocated a budget based on the donations that they bring in. If you are part of a community that wants its work to be subsidized, then you should start a staking cluster, and the way you do that is by working with the Panvala Caucus to make that happen. If you're excited about getting more and more communities on board so they can have their work subsidized as well, then you should be a part of the Panvala Caucus. That's what we do. We try to make sure the system is working each quarter. We're trying to get more communities on board so they can benefit from it. We want to show people that this is already working. It has been working for 2 quarters, matching at 11.2x 2 quarters ago, matching at 12.9x last quarter, and we'll see what it matches at this upcoming quarter with the donation matching that's happening in the last 2 weeks of June on Gitcoin grants. So I'll open it up for Q&A. If you have any questions, I'd love to hear them.
Yeah, so this is awesome. Thank you so much for doing this. Very, very excited about this. So if you want to join or participate, I guess there's kind of 2 options, right? If you're a project that got some PAN tokens, say you participate in Gitcoin grants, get some PAN tokens, then you have to stake those. And does the organization stake as an entity, or is it a specific person from the organization that then stakes for the organization? Like, how does that process work?
That's a great question. So right now we're encouraging individuals to stake. We want people to understand that they can earn subsidies for their community by taking the initiative and staking on their own. We don't prevent organizations as a whole from staking. So for instance, I believe DXDAO has staked some of their collective tokens to earn their staking. But one way to compare it is like to the enterprise software market, right? Where there's some products where the whole company has to like get it through their, like there's a sales team working to get the whole company to buy it. But then there's like the Slack model where individual employees can just start a Slack and get other people on board, and eventually it snowballs from there. We want to be that second model. So we want individuals from communities to be able to take the initiative on their own and say, hey, I'm going to earn some matching for my community. I'm just going to do it. And then have other people be able to say, hey, I want to add capacity to our staking cluster, so I'm just going to do it. So it doesn't have to be the organization's tokens being staked, but it can be if you want to do it that way.
Okay, cool. And then where should people go if they want to stake their tokens?
So right now you email the Panvala Caucus if you want to start a staking cluster. To add tokens to an existing staking cluster, we're going to launch that interface next week. So next week is kind of the lead up to our next matching round. And for the existing 5 communities that have staking clusters, we want individuals from those communities to be able to say, I want my community to have more capacity. So I'm going to use the pan I already have or get some pan and stake it with my community so we can have the capacity to match even more donations to the projects that we care about. So that's what's going to happen next week. But to start a new cluster for a new community, that's really like just a social conversation about how we get that done.
Awesome. So then if people want to contribute, they should email. And then once there's like, a couple staking pools, people can then join in to contribute and participate.
Exactly that.
Awesome.
How much are the staking pools staking?
So right now, each staking pool is staking 75,000 pan. So the kind of model that we had for this first round was that each staking cluster has a contact and an alternate contact, and that's basically just the people that we go to figure out what the community has decided for a quarter. Like they don't have any special power because again, it's a matching budget. People have to donate for a budget to be earned in the first place. But it's just the people within the community that the caucus goes to figure out what the community has decided. So the contact stakes 50,000 pan and the alternate contact stakes 25,000 pan. And that's how these clusters have been started. So they all have the same number of stakes tokens right now. Once we start the staking interface next week, we expect members from different communities to stake tokens in those clusters, and they'll have different amounts after that.
What sort of grants are out there now?
So the most popular grants last quarter on Gitcoin, there was one security grant that was pretty popular. It was the white hat hacking grant from Samsung that got a lot of support. There was One Up World, which is kind of like a Telegram-based point system for basically distributing governance rights in a DAO. So when people do something that you want to reward them for, you just give them a one-up by sending a message to a Telegram bot, and it gives them tokens in a DAO. So that's a project that got some support. Those are the ones off the top of my head. I'll send you the link to the blog post or the forum post that goes through the top projects from last quarter. It was really interesting to see how the different people who got tokens use them. Some people had bills to pay, so they sold them. Some people have decided to create staking clusters with them. Both of those are totally acceptable outcomes. The coolest thing to see was like once people get their tokens, they can decide to sell immediately, right? But since it's the market decides the value of these tokens, we don't control the value. So some people sold immediately, the price dropped and went down to like 9 cents a token. Eventually, trading activity bumped it up to a high of, I think, 4 cents. It was 0.9 cents, so not a full cent per token. Trading activity bumped it up to 4 cents a token. So there are some people who sold their the tokens that they received for even higher than we expected them to be able to get for it when those grants were distributed. So it really just depends on what people decide to do with their tokens. People, if they decide to sell it all, when they decide to sell. We operate on a purely pan-denominated basis, where we just say, hey, this is how many donations came in pan. This is how much you're going to get in pan as a multiple of that, and then the dollar outcome just depends on what happened. But I'll send you this link to the post from this quarter, and I'll drop it in the chat.
Awesome, thanks. I was also checking out the website, and it looks like Bright ID was one of the projects that got grants in August of 2019.
Yeah, so we started Panvala with more of a direct grant model where people would apply for grants, basically ask the Panvala Caucus to say we want tokens for the work that we're doing, and we did 4 rounds of grants that way, or 5 rounds of grants that way. So there's a lot of teams that got direct token grants from the system rather than these matching grants that we now do. So there's a lot of ETH 2.0 projects that got token grants, Prismatic Labs, the Nimbus team at Status, ChainSafe, a lot of different ETH 2.0 teams got tokens that way. Gnosis did some work that got some tokens. There's a lot of different teams out there that got direct grants because we were focusing on trying to make sure that the infrastructure work that the whole community depends on had some sort of reward that would keep them going. There's a lot of competing projects with ETH 2.0 that are trying to create new blockchains, and they have a much more powerful incentive to keep people going. They can give people new tokens in the system. With the people who are working on Ethereum infrastructure, the incentive is very weak. So what we're hoping is that with the system that helps communities subsidize their work, if we're giving people a reward that can be used in that model, maybe it can be as strong of an incentive as these new blockchains that get started, which that incentive ends up splintering us apart. People start their own new projects with their own new token, but if we have a token that helps communities cooperate, maybe can keep us together, working on the same page and get more work done together. That's kind of the hope.
When you are doing the inflation, is it a set amount per quarter? Do you decide each quarter? Like, what's your total budget of allowable inflation, and how is that determined?
That's a great question. So the total maximum supply of the PAN token is 100 million tokens. That's our version of Bitcoin's 21 million tokens. And then like Bitcoin, we have a half-life of 4 years. So it's a programmatic inflation curve. We don't decide how many tokens come out each quarter. They just come out. The difference from the Bitcoin model is that when you pay a fee on the Bitcoin network, it just goes to the miner. It doesn't affect the inflation of the system. In Panvala, the donations go back into the token supply. So it's kind of like rewinding the inflation curve every time a donation is made. So it's not that we can predict out into the future, oh, this many tokens are going to be released on this date the way you can in Bitcoin, because all of our future inflation amounts depend on how much comes in donations in the meantime. So donations are always recharging that token supply, and it's designed that way because our goal is to reach an equilibrium at some point where the tokens coming out of the system are equal to the tokens coming into the system, and then we can proceed that way indefinitely. So the matching amount runs out, like eventually matching will go down to 1x, where tokens in equals tokens out, and there's not this additional subsidy from the token supply. But at 1x, we can keep operating indefinitely. It doesn't run out the way that Bitcoin does. Once Bitcoin subsidy goes to zero, the Bitcoin network has no control over the budget of its system. It's just whatever the fees come in is what the fees come in. In Panvala, we can operate indefinitely because the donations that come in are controlled by the system itself.
What would be the best place to go to better understand that model? Because I feel like I kind of get it from a high level, but the actual dynamics around the token supply and inflation and whatnot are still a bit fuzzy to me. So what would be the best place to go to like better understand that?
So the best place for that is the blog post that I wrote on ETH Research about what I call the circuit token model. It's kind of an abstraction of what's happening in Panvala and applying it to Bitcoin and Ethereum itself, because there's a proposal to start basically burning some of the fees on the Bitcoin network. It's called EIP 1559. Once that EIP is actually implemented, then Ethereum itself will look a lot like Panvala does in the circuit token model, where the source of the tokens in a system are the sink as well. Like Ethereum will be putting out tokens to reward miners, but then some of the transaction fees will go back into the token supply as well. So there's a spreadsheet linked from that forum post that kind of has a generalized version of this model. So you can plug in the numbers for Panvala, you can plug in the numbers for Bitcoin, and kind of see over time how the different variables affect what happens in the future.
Cool, awesome.
Let me know if that actually helps or not, because I want people to understand this more, and I'm not sure what works yet. So if that circuit token explanation approach works, I want to know. If you need something else, I want to know that too.
For sure. Another question, I guess, is that throughout the presentation, I think at one point you mentioned if people want to get involved, they can get involved in the Panvala Caucus directly, which seems like it's different than being involved in staking your tokens and asking for grants. So is that a different way to contribute? And if so, like, what does that look like?
So you can really do both. So like joining the Panvala Caucus is something that we really encourage people to do. It's like if you want to be closely involved with Panvala itself, if you believe in its mission of helping subsidize communities, we need your help to actually get that done. When people stake tokens for their own already existing community, that's great too. And a lot of the people who are staking tokens are also members of the Panvala Caucus. So not every person staking right now is in the caucus, but we're going to try to get them all on board. It's not a requirement, but we really want them on board. But you can also just stake for your community and not worry so much about what's going on in Panvala. Just worry about what's going on in your community independently and just be subsidized by Panvala. That's totally great too. So there are a couple different ways to be part of Panvala, and all of them are great.
Got it. So is it kind of like a DAO where you have to have tokens to then engage in the governance of the system? So then if you either buy Panvala tokens or get some via grants, then you can use those tokens to engage in the system to determine future grants and stuff.
It's exactly like that.
Okay, cool.
And our hope is that like people see the governance happening more through the staking than through voting, because Panvala itself is designed for voting to be rare. Since only one proposal can go through a quarter and you lose your staked tokens if your proposal loses, the ideal state of the system is for there to only be one proposal. And when there's one proposal, there's no vote held. The system assumes that if one proposal goes in and then time has expired without another proposal coming in, that consensus was achieved off chain. So then there's no need to vote at all, and that's the ideal state. When there are disputes, there's going to be votes on chain, and that's when you get out your tokens, you cast your vote on chain, and that's what's going to decide which side of the dispute the system takes. But in the normal case, you're not voting with your tokens every quarter. But what you are doing with your tokens is you're staking with them, so your community can benefit and you can have control over the budget within your community. We want to push as much outside of Panvala as possible because we want the real influence over where the tokens go to come from which communities are the most active, which communities are donating the most money to support what's going on in their community. So that's really the shape and the activity of Panvala should be shaped more by the donation activity, how much people donate, which communities they choose to donate with, than by what happens with the token holders voting. We're trying to structure the game so people can play the game, but the way people play the game is what determines what happens.
That's very cool. It kind of reminds me a little bit of a source cred, where by playing the game, you influence what is prioritized, which then gets feeds back into how people contribute and play the game. But in a different model, it's much simpler without pay drink. So that's great.
Yeah, and I like source cred as well. Hopefully for next quarter, we can subsidize some source cred communities as well, because it's designed for a token to be in there called Grain. If we can get source cred communities to donate some pan, maybe we can just subsidize what's going on there with our token supply and show people that source cred can actually work. Like, I think source cred is going to work very well. And I think it's easier to see that it can work very well if there's subsidies flowing through it. If instead of having just people trying to buy some grain and support it that way, if you can have 12 times the impact by donating pan, I think people will see how quickly, I think people will realize how well source cred already works much more quickly with that kind of subsidy.
Yeah, that would be really cool.
Any other questions?
Yeah, kind of. Well, the Panvala, both like tech and ecosystem. What's like the next kind of milestone you're trying to aim to hit with the community?
So that's a good question. We really want to see we're trying to get to a point where the system can really sustain itself. So right now the system's working and it's amplifying people's donations at 12x. That to me is a sign that the system is working, and I show people those numbers all the time. They may not believe it, but the people who got the matching funds on Gitcoin grants the last quarter and sold it, they actually got US dollars and they paid their bills, so it's working. But what the goal that I'm aiming towards is for the system to be able to sustain itself. And what that means is basically for the marketing work, the development work that's happening for the system to be run every quarter. Right now, that's effectively, I just do that stuff with no direct reward. When I can do that stuff and the system itself can actually fund it, because there's enough coming out of the system each quarter to do that, that's really what the next milestone is, because at that point, the system is kind of default alive. Right now, the system is kind of default dead. Like if I get hit by a bus, Panvala probably disappears. But if it gets to the point where anybody could make money by helping facilitate what's going on with Panvala, then it's default alive. If I get hit by a bus, someone's gonna be like, oh, there's money to be made. I'm gonna go do that work, and it's great there. So the next real milestone is to be default alive, which really takes more donation activity, more staking activity, more demand for the token. Ideally, it can get to a point where it's able to fund people who aren't just dreamers trying to make Panvala work, people who are just trying to pay their bills.
That makes a lot of sense, and I feel that. Do you think the biggest blocker you've had is like people, like the donators, like which group of users do you think has like been your biggest blocker to make the Panvala community kind of get to that next level?
I think it's really the donors. So if you look at last quarter on Gitcoin grants, I think the percentage of donations that happened in Pan was much less than 1%.
So if we also take the fact that the donations that happened in Pan were extremely beneficial for the recipients, like in actual US dollars, because some of them sold. The idea that the rest of those donors aren't donating in Pan is kind of nuts. Like we need to get the message out there so people know that they can be benefiting their grantees so much more by donating in Pan. So really where I see the next growth coming from is by converting existing Gitcoin grant donors to use Pan, because they can have their grant subsidized even further by doing it that way. Once we go beyond that, once we get to that point, I think it's really about expanding beyond just the Ethereum community and growing donations that way.
Ron, if you got 10x the Pan donations in the next Gitcoin round, would that mean that there's suddenly you're only getting like a 1x match?
So that's entirely possible. So if there were 1.5 million Pan donated next quarter, like the matching budget is fixed. So you can't get to a point where it's not really that much matching anymore. The idea is that the market responds to the amount of donations that are happening. So it should be really hard to get 1.5 million Pan donated unless somebody who already has Pan decides to donate a lot of their existing Pan. Like it can break in the current model that we've designed. But for people who don't already have Pan, to acquire 1.5 million Pan and donate it is both very hard, and also it doesn't make sense for them to do that unless they just want to demonstrate that the system can break. So if somebody's really eager to demonstrate that it can break, they can break it. It's totally breakable. But if for rational actors, if there's demand to make that many donations, then the price should also respond.
You had said that you can cash out Pan for USD. That's not through Pan, right? Panvala, right? That's like probably through like a liquidity market, right? Is there like a good liquidity pool around this? How much does the price move when someone cashes out to USD? Like, is that like a really sustainable future, or is that like just kind of a quick selling point right now?
So right now, most of the exchanges happen on Uniswap. So people just, when they want to make a donation, they buy Pan on Uniswap and make a donation.
Right.
When recipients want to use their Pan to pay their bills, they sell their Pan on Uniswap for Ether or USD, like DAI or USDC. So that's where most of it's happening right now. There isn't a ton of liquidity, so the price is volatile. The expectation is that over time, market will actually develop. So it's not like Uniswap isn't a core part of the system. It's just a part that, like, it's just where liquidity currently is. If Panvala gets more mature, you would have trading on all sorts of secondary markets, like with order books, with more liquid trading, et cetera. So the lack of liquidity is inherent to any early token.
Right.
Bitcoin wasn't liquid in 2009. Pan isn't extremely liquid in 2020. But if there's demand to subsidize communities in this kind of way and demand to donate in this kind of way, that could develop over time. That's the goal.
Yeah, that makes sense. I didn't know if there was a natural part of the Panvala function, but now as I think through kind of like token economics that you were kind of speaking to earlier, that secondary market kind of plays a pretty key role in general. So, cool.
All right. Well, thanks for coming, everybody. We really want to have you involved in the Panvala Caucus if you want to help other communities subsidize the work that they're doing. If you're already part of a community and you want to subsidize the work that's happening in your community, we want to help you plug into Panvala so you can earn some of those subsidies and work with the other communities to increase those subsidies over time. So we're looking forward to working with you and showing more and more people how they can amplify the work that's happening on a voluntary basis. It doesn't have to be a profit-seeking corporation that's using equity to amplify the work that it can do. It doesn't have to be a monopolistic government that's using its own currency to amplify what it can do. We can use the civic sector of our society to do a lot more work on a voluntary basis if we can bootstrap it by subsidizing it in this kind of way. And I think if Panvala actually works the way I expect it to, the civic sector of our society could be the most important one. Rather than worrying about what's happening in politics, where it's winner take all outcomes, or worrying about what the corporation is doing each quarter to please the traders with its earnings reports, we could be more oriented around what we want to do with the people who choose to be a part of our communities, the people who choose to work with us. And if we could amplify that, if we could grow that, I think a lot more people would be a lot happier. So looking forward to doing that with you guys. Thank you.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Ron.
Awesome,
And Ron,
thanks.
thanks for putting on Rush Week.